Can reading about some corporate executive committing, a multi-million-dollar fraud make you more likely to fudge the numbers on your expense report? Or maybe your timesheet?
It sounds pretty unlikely on the surface, doesn't it?
Totally counterintuitive.
Ugh.
But the research we're diving into today suggests there's actually a surprising connection there.
It really does feel disconnected. You see these huge scandals way up there, and it feels like a completely different world from, our own small everyday decisions, maybe adding an extra hour, like you said, or that coffee receipt. But the sources you've shared, they explore exactly this, what the researchers are calling spillover effects of corporate misconduct.
Right, so this deep dive is all about that ripple effect. How does bad behavior at the very top, maybe in some complex financial area you're not even involved in, how does that potentially influence ethical behavior further down, among people who aren't even peers?
Exactly. People not directly involved. And our mission today, based on this stack of research you provided, is really to unpack what they found about this spillover. And maybe even more importantly, whether seeing those executives actually get punished can somehow deter others. Stop that ripple.
Okay, let's unpack this then.
So first off, it's pretty well established, right? And the sources mention prior research confirming this. Corporate misconduct, like fraudulent financial reporting, FFR, it causes direct harm.
Sure. Shareholders lose money, the company's reputation tanks. We get that.
That's the obvious part. Hurts shareholders, damages the company, can lead to bankruptcy even.
Yeah, the stock plummets, you see the headlines, but you're saying this research looks beyond that direct damage.
It asks, does that big, high-profile wrongdoing cause other sort of incremental, unethical behavior elsewhere? Does it loosen the ethical fabric a bit?
And this idea of spillover isn't completely out of the blue.
No, the sources point to earlier work. Things like firms being more likely to manage their own earnings after a local competitor announced they had to restate their financials.
Okay, that makes a bit more sense. A competitor does something shady, maybe you feel pressure or see an opportunity.
Right. Peer effects are kind of understandable, but this research goes further. It looks at effects on non-peers, people totally outside that company or industry.
Non-peers? Like who?
Well, the sources even cite one study suggesting that things like financially motivated neighborhood crimes, robberies, thefts actually increased in areas after a local company's major fraud was revealed.
Wow. That's a much wider ripple than I expected.
How? How could that happen? What's the mechanism they propose?
They suggest two main pathways. The first is about descriptive norms.
Okay, descriptive norms.
This is basically our perception of what's typical, what behavior is common out there in society. So when you see misconduct, especially by someone prominent like a CEO,
it can subtly shift your own belief about how often that kind of thing actually happens. If top executives are doing it, maybe the unconscious thought becomes, well, maybe people often lie for financial gain.
So even if you think it's wrong, just seeing it happen makes it feel more normal. Like it's just part of the landscape.
Precisely. It adjusts your internal gauge of the behavioral environment. The second mechanism they talk about is advantageous comparison.
Advantageous comparison. How does that work?
Well, if you see truly huge misconduct, like a multi-billion-dollar fraud.
Right, something really egregious.
Exactly. It can make your own potential much smaller misdeeds padding that expense report, adding that hour seem less severe by comparison.
Ah, I see. It's like, well, what I'm thinking of doing is practically nothing compared to that massive fraud.
Yes. It helps you rationalize it, makes it easier to justify before you even do it. You distance your potential action from wrongness by comparing it to something much, much worse.
Okay, that makes sense psychologically. And the research actually found evidence for this spillover.
Strongly. They ran 2 experiments, and the first key finding really backs this up.
What did they find specifically?
In both experiments, they had participants read hypothetical news reports. Some read about executives engaging in significant financial misreporting, but crucially, with no mention of punishment yet.
Okay.
And those participants were then significantly more likely to misreport their own performance in a completely unrelated task they did afterwards.
Unrelated. So the executive fraud was like cooking the books.
Right, maybe revenue recognition or something.
And the participant's task was?
Totally different. In one, it was searching for letters in a grid and reporting how many they found. In the other, it was decoding letters and calculating earnings based on time. Deliberately unrelated tasks.
And just reading about the executive misreporting made people more likely to cheat on those tasks.
That's what they found. Consistent across both experiments, it supports their first hypothesis, H1. Observing executive misreporting seems to lead to more unethical decisions among these non-peer observers. The spillover is real.
Okay, that's actually kind of alarming. Just exposure to this news has a subtle effect, making people bend the rules more themselves. Which brings us to the next big question then.
Right.
Can punishment stop that? Can seeing consequences push back against that negative influence?
That's exactly what the second part of the research looked into. I mean, a major goal of enforcement fines, prison, all that, it isn't just about the person who did wrong, it's about general deterrence.
Discouraging others.
Exactly. Discouraging others from doing similar things.
Yeah.
And the mechanism here involves injunctive norms.
Okay, we had descriptive norms, what people do. So injunctive norms are.
They're about what society views as acceptable versus unacceptable, what you should or shouldn't do. Punishment acts as a really clear signal.
It draws a line in the sand.
Precisely. It says this behavior, it's wrong, and there are consequences. It reinforces that boundary.
So seeing someone get punished reinforces the idea that, okay, this isn't just common, it's actively disapproved of and penalized by society.
Exactly. It strengthens that sense of what's considered right, or at least what's considered wrong and punishable. And the second key finding, H2, from their research, it supports this deterrence idea.
How so?
Across both experiments, when the news reports included information that the executive was punished, that spillover effect was significantly mitigated.
Ah, okay. So punishment did make a difference.
Yes, participant misreporting went down compared to when they just read about the fraud with no consequences mentioned.
That's good news then.
Mm-hmm.
It suggests seeing punishment can actually counteract that negative ethical spillover, at least in these experiments.
It really suggests observed punishments can influence those injunctive norms, those perceptions of what's acceptable, and help curb unethical behavior among people just observing.
All right, let's dig into the specifics, though, because they looked at different types of punishment, didn't they?
They did. They examined 3 types, and they based them on sort of real-world averages and sentencing guidelines for executives caught in financial fraud.
What were the 3 types?
A significant monetary fine, a prison sentence, and something less common, a court-ordered public shaming.
Okay, what kind of amounts of duration are we talking about in this study?
The fine mentioned in the reports was $14.4 million. The prison sentence was 6 years.
Wow, substantial. And the public shaming? How does that work?
It was described as a court-ordered televised statement. The executive had to publicly admit their guilt and state explicitly that lying for financial gain is unacceptable.
Huh. That feels potent, maybe in a different way than fines or prison.
It does, and it turned out to be really significant, especially when you factor in the 2 different experimental setups they used. They weren't identical.
Ah, right. You mentioned the experiments differed in a key way. What was that again?
Observability, how easy it was for the researchers to tell if a participant was misreporting.
Okay.
So experiment 1 used that letter search task. It was designed so participant misreporting was basically unobservable to the experimenter. You just wrote down how many letters you found.
So your individual lie, if you made one, was hidden in the group data.
Exactly. You had anonymity. Now, experiment 2 used the letter decoding and earnings calculation task. And that was designed so participant misreporting was directly observable.
How?
The researchers knew how long the task took, so they knew the correct earnings. They could directly see if a participant reported earning more than they actually should have.
Got it. So in experiment 2, you knew you could potentially get caught if you fudged the numbers. Why was that difference important?
Well, it seems to have dramatically changed which type of punishment actually worked as a deterrent. The results were quite different across the 2 experiments.
Okay, lay it on us. What happened with fines, prison, and shaming in experiment 1 where cheating was hidden?
In experiment 1, the unobservable setting. Observing imprisonment for the executive was the only punishment that significantly reduced participant misreporting compared to the control group that saw no punishment.
Only prison.
Only prison had a statistically significant effect. Seeing the executive get fined that $14.4 million, or seeing them publicly shamed, didn't significantly deter people when they felt their own misreporting couldn't be seen.
Interesting. So if you think you won't get caught yourself, the only thing that really makes you pause is seeing someone face that very severe consequence of losing their freedom.
That seems to be the implication in that context. Now, contrast that with experiment 2, where misreporting was observable.
Where you knew the researchers could potentially see if you inflated your earnings.
Right. In that situation, observing the public shaming was the only punishment type that significantly deterred misreporting.
Wait, really? Not the fine, not the prison sentence?
Not significantly, no. Only the public shaming made a difference when participants knew their actions could be seen.
Wow. So the punishment that might seem less severe in some ways, no huge financial hit, no loss of liberty, was the effective one, but only when the observer felt their own potential slip-up could be exposed. That's fascinating.
It is really striking, and the researchers suggest this finding might actually generalize quite well to many real-world situations for non-executives. Think about timesheets, expense reports, tax filings.
Right, situations where your actions aren't totally invisible. There's at least a chance of being discovered.
Exactly. In those contexts, seeing a powerful figure publicly shamed and having to state that lying for gain is wrong, that might hit closer to home. It might make the potential social cost, the embarrassment, the reputational damage of getting caught yourself
Yeah.
feel much more real and salient.
So it's less about the direct penalty maybe and more about reinforcing that social boundary, that sense of potential exposure and condemnation, especially when your own actions could be seen.
That seems to be the mechanism they're pointing towards. And it's extra interesting because they also asked participants how severe they perceived each punishment to be.
Yeah.
Generally, people saw public shaming as less severe overall than the big fine or the prison time, particularly regarding financial impact.
Yet it was the most effective deterrent in the observable setting.
Exactly, which reinforces the idea that deterrence isn't just about perceived harshness. It's about how effectively a punishment reinforces those norms, especially the injunctive ones, what's considered unacceptable.
And did they check if that's how it worked? Through changing the perception of norms?
They did. They ran what's called a mediation analysis, and it suggested that both imprisonment in experiment 1, the unobservable one, and public shaming in experiment 2, the observable one worked at least partly, by increasing participants' perception of those injunctive norms. Seeing the punishment solidified the belief that misreporting is unacceptable behavior.
Okay, so stepping back, what does all this mean for you, the listener, in your everyday life?
Well, it suggests those big corporate scandals you read about, they aren't just news about faraway executives. This research indicates they can subtly influence the broader ethical climate, potentially nudging your own ethical barometer, even in completely unrelated things like filling out forms or logging work hours. It sets a kind of tone for society.
And, maybe more constructively, it really underscores the power of seeing consequences. It's not just about justice for that one specific crime. Seeing wrongdoers punished actively reinforces the boundaries of acceptable behavior for everyone watching. It pushes back against that negative spillover.
It firms up that line. And the nuance about punishment type is really thought-provoking. The most effective deterrent might depend on the context specifically, whether your own potential misstep feels hidden or potentially observable. Prison might deter the unseen act, while shame deters the act that could come to light.
Now, we should definitely mention the limitations, as the researchers themselves do. This is based on, one specific hypothetical case, specific punishment amounts.
Right. What if the fraud was smaller?
Yeah.
Or the punishment's harsher or maybe weaker? What about seeing multiple examples over time?
Yeah, lots of open questions there that this specific research didn't tackle, but it gives us a lot to think about.
Absolutely. It's a starting point for understanding these complex dynamics.
Okay, so just to recap the core findings really concisely. High-profile corporate fraud seems to have this real, measurable spillover effect, making unrelated people slightly more likely to behave unethically.
But, crucially, seeing the executives get punished helps counteract that effect. It seems to work mainly by strengthening our shared understanding that such behavior is just not acceptable.
And very interestingly, the type of punishment that works best might depend on whether the observer feels their own potential misdeeds could be discovered, with imprisonment being more effective for potentially hidden acts and public shaming more effective for potentially observable ones.
Which leaves us with a final kind of powerful thought for you to mull over. If seeing punishment for unethical behavior helps reinforce society's ethical boundaries, could the opposite also be true? Could hearing positive stories, seeing well-publicized examples of high integrity and ethical leadership, could that have a similar power to shape our behavior, but in a positive direction? Could it create a positive spillover?
That's a really important question to consider, isn't it?